examine the economic impact of Brexit. I think both Julian and I both recognise that there is a near consensus, at least among what used to be called the chattering classes, that the impact of Brexit has been both negative and substantial. But our contention is pretty well the opposite of that. And it is that this consensus is not based on any very sound evidence and is magnified by an unbalanced coverage in important parts of the media, some of which Maureen used to work in, so I won't name names. But in this presentation, we just want to focus on the facts of the matter. Our full evidence is presented on a long report on the Briefings for Britain website, and in this report, and we've got a few copies here if anyone wants to take one away. So, let's start with GDP. What's actually happened to GDP since the referendum and since we joined the single market in beginning of 2021? We can see there that over the longer term, the UK has followed the G7 reasonably closely, but coming out of the recession around COVID, the UK recovery has been a bit slower than the UK average, than the G7 average by a couple of percent. But if we take the US out of the G7, then the UK is actually better. So it looks like the UK is pretty important in this. And the reason why the US plays a big role is because there's been a really quite strong fiscal expansion in the US under both Trump and recently under Biden. There's the evidence for it. I won't dwell on that, but we can come back to it in questions if anybody wants to talk about it. Here's the individual members of the G7 looking at growth in GDP since 2015, just before the referendum. The UK is the solid red line, and you can see it's pretty much in the middle there. It's better than most, well, similar or better than most European members of the G7 and Japan, but it's been slower than the US, which is the purple line at the top, and Canada, the one underneath. Now, there's two things to say about this slide. One is, if you get your magnifying glasses out and look very carefully, you can pick a period at the end of 2019, just to the left of the first vertical line. Pick out a period there when the growth between then and the latest figures at the end of 2022 are just slightly negative for the UK. And the UK over that particular period was the slowest growing of each of those countries. But look, it's very slight. It really doesn't mean very much in my view. And we'll have to see what happens from here on in. And one of the things about Brexit is I think it will take a while for us to really know whether the impact has been negative or positive. My own personal view, and I did quite a bit of modelling on this in the days when the Treasury was was allowed to put out reports, and my view always was that it would make very little difference either way, and that seems to be happening, but we'll have to see. Sorry, just one other thing to say about this is there's a measurement problem here. The way the ONS measures output in the public sector in the UK is different from nearly all the other countries, and it exaggerates the downturn. For instance, on their measure, there was something like a 20% fall in the output of the NHS during the pandemic. Now, my daughter and son-in-law both work in the NHS, and it was news to them that there was any fall in output since they were working their socks off. Other countries do it a different way. And it's probably the case that the UK's fall in GDP in the middle of the pandemic was probably about half of what's normally shown in the figures. And that affects the recovery as well. So we can look at something like manufacturing output, which isn't affected by measurement of public sector output. We see that, sorry, in this case, the UK is the blue line. We can see the UK has done better than France, Germany, Italy over the whole period. If you take the latest periods since we joined the single market, beginning of 21, then there's some convergence back. But whether that's of any significance or due to Brexit, we'll have to wait and see. But overall, if we take the whole period from the referendum right the way through, manufacturing output in the UK has outperformed the other countries. Now, it seems to me that having seen this evidence, that ought to be enough, really. The UK is clearly doing okay. We'd say that not much evidence that Brexit has helped the UK, but very little evidence that it's hindered it either. But quite a few commentators are not willing to let it go at that. So it's been quite common and well publicised to have counterfactuals instead, arguments that the UK, which usually produce the conclusion that the UK was doing better before Brexit than most other countries and would have continued to do so. And the fact that it hasn't, therefore, suggests that even though the UK is doing okay, it could have done better, and the effect of Brexit is therefore negative. The most widely publicised of these, I think, is the counterfactual exercise undertaken by the Centre for European Reform, CER, in what's usually called their Doppelganger analysis. And what they did for GDP was to have an index which was a weighted average of 22 other countries. It's the dotted line here. So it's quite similar to the UK before the referendum, which is marked by the vertical line there. But afterwards, the UK falls below it. And the conclusion, I think, of CER, John will tell us, is that the UK has underperformed by about 5.5%, and that's the loss due to Brexit. There are the weights for the 22 countries. So US at the top, about 30% weight, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Greece is in there, Iceland, Ireland. But one of the first things, well, two things to say here. First is it's tuned up to 2016 on a period of recovery in the UK from the recession connected with the banking crisis. But the more important thing to say, I think, is that there isn't much correlation between individual members of this index and the UK. So the UK is blue here, and the other two are Australia and New Zealand. So they're clearly growing faster than the UK. They grew faster before the referendum, and they've continued to grow faster. So not terribly obvious why you would want to have them in an index. Even worse is somewhere like Greece. So you can see Greece was in a real mess up until just before 2016. The UK was growing, but the Greek economy declined by about 25%. But the decline did stop. At least there was very little growth after 2016, but at least it wasn't declining. But that change from decline to growth helps to bump up the Doppelganger index. But here's the key thing. The Doppelganger index is almost the same as the US. So you could just say, let's compare with the USA rather than all these 22 countries. What are the other 21 countries doing? Well, they're just, some of them are faster, some of them are slower. They're offsetting each other, perhaps just filling in little gaps here, but contributing very little in aggregate. And when I look at this, by the way, and do a regression, no country other than the US is statistically significant as a long-term influence. So these other countries in this index are also not statistically significant. So what happens if we compare, let's say, Germany with the US? You get something which looks even worse than the UK. UK was a 5% gap by the end of the period. Germany is about 10%. So Germany seems to have done worse. So if you follow the CER's logic, I think you ought to say that Germany was suffering from a really bad effect of Brexit. And what about Japan? There we got about 20% fall. Even though it's a long way away, Brexit has a long reach and so on. So look, our conclusion is that this is really a statistical artifact. The index includes places like Iceland, which only got two exports to talk about, hardly a comparator for the UK. Also includes Ireland, where the GDP figures are close to meaningless because of its tax haven status. What Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner, calls leprechaun economics. Can I just get a drink of water there? So we view this as a statistical artifact, and other than the US, it hasn't got much meaning. And it's fairly obvious why the UK, Germany, Japan and other countries fell behind the US after 2016, essentially after Trump became president. So let's move on quickly now from GDP to investment. And perhaps the most common and we would claim misleading claim is that Brexit has reduced business investment, thereby reducing growth. And in the calculations of Jonathan Haskells of the Bank of England, cost each family in the UK £1,000. This is achieved by putting a trend through a cyclical upturn. Again, the post-banking collapse cyclical upturn in business investment. This graph, by the way, is one of the most common you'll see anywhere. It's appeared several times in the Financial Times. It's appeared twice on a Newsnight programme 2 weeks ago, just in case you didn't get the point first time. They thought they'd show it again. So the idea is you have a trend here. You assume this trend goes on essentially forever, and the UK has underperformed.
Just as a point of order, Graham, I mean, Jonathan's not here to defend himself. I mean, I've got his paper here, and his trend line starts in 1998. He doesn't do it in 2006. So,
Okay,
I'm just making a point of order here, but that's not what Jonathan did. I just think it's fair on him to.
And on this issue, fatwas about not going over time. So I hope that could be added onto my time. But yeah, but please do make points like that. Fair enough. If you fit a longer term trend from 1997 through to 2016, it's that. And the importance of this is that by 2016, by the time of the referendum, then business investment would have been well above trend, and you can reasonably argue that it was then due for a cyclical downturn. Indeed, when I fit equations to this, it does predict a downturn after 2016. UK in blue there, Germany in brown. You can see from 1997, right the way through, business investment, not that different from Germany. And the UK finishes up a little bit above Germany. It's below France. France was faster growing business investment before the referendum and continued to be faster afterwards. Now here's Jonathan Haskells' chart. Seems to me it's fair enough to show it whether he's here or not. And what Jonathan did was to fit a trend between 2 points, one in 1997 and the other one second quarter of 2016. And the importance of that is that if you fit that trend, then 2016 has to be on the trend, because that's how you fitted it. And therefore you can't argue, or you don't know whether that point is above or beyond trend and what was likely to happen. Jonathan then just increases it 2%. He then allows for the pandemic, but he adds on 2% per annum all the time. One other point to notice here is he was using out-of-date data, and the revised data from ONS is about 10% higher at the end than his data. Finally, on investment, let's look at foreign direct investment into the UK. This is in millions of dollars, UN data. And UK is the top line in blue. Very little sign there that Brexit has affected anything very much. And if foreign investors aren't too concerned about Brexit, I mean, they're the people this is where I might expect it to show up, where, excuse me, if investors were worried about Brexit, we'd perhaps expect that line to come down. Some people have pointed out that the gap with Germany has narrowed, but the gap between France and Italy and the UK hasn't narrowed. Seems to me, again, UK doing okay. And finally, in my section, let's come on to trade. This is UK export volumes, excluding oil and erratics. And here we see the blue line is UK exports of goods to the EU, and it's recovered the previous level. But actually, I think this is quite significant. It's done better than UK exports to non-EU countries. There have been all sorts of things going on here. There have been supply shortages of chips, for instance, from the Far East, which have affected car exports to both Europe and elsewhere. But if UK exports have been doing better to the EU than to other countries, again, it doesn't really suggest that Brexit has had a big effect. Some people have tried to say, well, difficulty of getting imports from Europe has affected exports to anywhere else, but really I don't think that, doesn't seem to be much evidence for that, and it doesn't seem a very logical argument. This is just to show the turbulence around 2021. There was some stock building just before we left the single market, and then a big downturn, particularly in January. And it's taken a while, taken something like 18 months to recover, but it does look as if we've recovered. There is evidence, I think, that small companies have found the additional paperwork onerous and stopped exporting to Europe. But that effect doesn't seem to be large enough to really affect the total or the aggregate. What should we have expected? UK goods exports to the EU tend to follow manufacturing output in the Eurozone, which is the blue line. And certainly since we left the single market, quite a bit of turbulence there. But by the end, we seem to have got back to that long-term trend. So again, I think no great impact there, and pretty well ditto for service exports. So, conclusions. 3 conclusions here. Firstly, no real evidence of substantial negative impacts on the UK economy due to Brexit, despite what you might read in the paper or hear on the BBC almost any day of the week. Attempts to use counterfactuals, in our view, are just grossly misleading, and I think we really would argue that people should stop doing that sort of work. It's leading to a wrong conclusion. And finally, I think the continued focus on Brexit and mention of Brexit as a negative impact, we feel is undermining true understanding of the UK's economic difficulties. UK has real economic difficulties, and these really started at the banking crisis. The lack of growth in productivity, or the lack of sign of any pickup in productivity since, is a real problem. It affects public expenditure, affects everything, like all the holes in the road. I don't know what it's like in London. In Cambridge, you take your life in your hands driving anywhere. So the slow growth of the UK economy is a real problem. But in our view, it's not due to Brexit. And if people would stop saying so, then we could start to concentrate, I think, on what the real factors are. With that, I'll finish. Thank you.